The power went out with a sudden snap, not a gradual dimming but an instant plunge into silence. My refrigerator stopped humming. The lights died, and the presentation I had spent weeks preparing for the mayor and city council flickered away on my laptop screen. I stood in my cabin's sudden darkness, extension cords from 3 neighbors' houses already snaking across my lawn, when I saw her walking up my driveway. Marlene Hodgkins, HOA president, clipboard in hand, and that plastic smile stretched across her face. Behind her, the mayor's car was turning the corner onto our street. Marlene did not know who was about to witness her handiwork. She did not know what she had just done. She had no idea that her reign of suburban tyranny was about to end. Because when you cut the power to silence a homeowner, you should make absolutely certain their guest list does not include the entire city government. I found my dream cabin 3 years ago on the northern ridge of Pinecrest Community. It was everything I had imagined: cedar walls weathered to a perfect silver gray, a wraparound deck that captured mountain views from 3 directions, and windows that filled every room with golden afternoon light. The forest pressed close on 2 sides, giving the illusion of wilderness despite being just 30 minutes from downtown. I fell in love immediately. My realtor, however, seemed nervous. "Before you decide, I need to make sure you understand about the Homeowners Association," she said, handing me a 3-ring binder nearly 4 inches thick. "Pinecrest has one of the most thorough HOAs in the county. Some people find it restrictive." I accepted the binder without much concern. I had lived with HOA rules before. How bad could it be? The cabin itself was worth whatever bureaucratic hoops I would need to jump through. I signed the papers 2 weeks later, becoming the proud owner of 2487 North Ridge Way. The first month passed in domestic bliss. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough. The Johnsons to my left brought over a homemade apple pie. The elderly couple to my right, the Bradleys, offered gardening advice for maintaining native plants. Even those across the street, a young family with 2 small children, waved cheerfully whenever our paths crossed. Then came my first encounter with Marlene Hodgkins, Pinecrest HOA president for 15 consecutive years. She appeared on my porch one Tuesday morning, not to welcome me, but to inform me that my garbage bin had been visible from the street for approximately 72 minutes after collection. The official Pinecrest HOA guidelines permitted only 60 minutes. "Just a friendly reminder," she said, though her tone suggested nothing friendly. Her pen scratched against her ever-present clipboard. "We all have to maintain standards." I apologized and promised to be more attentive. It seemed a small matter. I did not realize this was just the opening salvo. Over the next several months, I received official notices about unapproved wind chimes. Section 432 prohibited auditory decorations exceeding ambient noise levels. A bird feeder that attracted excessive wildlife. Section 719 and the unthinkable offense of having placed my holiday decorations 4 days before the officially sanctioned decorating period. My neighbors shared their own stories. The Johnsons had been fined for planting vegetables without submitting proper documentation of species and layout. The young family across the street had received a violation for children's toys visible in their yard after 6:00 p.m. Even the Bradleys, celebrating their 50th year in the neighborhood, had been cited when their grandchildren's chalk drawings remained on their private walkway overnight. Despite these frustrations, I maintained a cordial public relationship with Marlene and the board. I was building a life here, after all. The cabin had become my sanctuary, a place where I worked remotely as an environmental consultant, specializing in sustainable community development. This background would prove important in the events to come. It was this professional expertise that led to my involvement with the Regional Watershed Protection Initiative. When concerning patterns emerged in our county's water quality reports, I was among the specialists consulted. The issues centered around improper development practices in exactly the type of mountainside communities where I now lived. Someone needed to coordinate between municipal authorities and local residents. Someone with environmental expertise, community connections, and a space to host important discussions. That someone, it seemed, would be me. When I received a call from Mayor Sanderson's office asking if I would host a preliminary meeting with her and several city council members, I agreed without hesitation. I did not know then that this simple civic duty would set me on a collision course with Marlene Hodgkins and the full power of the Pinecrest HOA. The Watershed Protection Initiative was not just another environmental policy discussion. Our mountain community faced genuine threats from poorly regulated development. Recent construction on the eastern slope had already caused minor mudslides after heavy rains. Engineers warned that without intervention, we risked serious infrastructure damage, potential drinking water contamination, and habitat destruction for protected species. I spent weeks preparing maps, environmental impact assessments, and preliminary action proposals. Mayor Sanderson had shown surprising interest when I presented initial findings at a public forum. Unlike many politicians who offered platitudes about environmental concerns without committing to action, she asked detailed questions and requested follow-up information. "We need to see these affected areas firsthand," she told me after reviewing my data, "and meet with residents who understand both the environmental concerns and the community needs." 2 days later, her assistant called. The mayor wanted to visit my cabin, which offered direct views of the problem areas and backed against the protected watershed. She would bring 3 city council members, the municipal water director, and the county's environmental compliance officer. Given the technical nature of the discussion, her chief of staff would attend as well. Could I host them next Saturday? I agreed immediately, then remembered my obligations as a Pinecrest resident. The HOA bylaws required notification for any gathering exceeding 5 non-resident guests. I downloaded the proper form from the community portal and submitted it electronically 3 weeks before the scheduled meeting. I included every required detail: the number of expected attendees, purpose of the gathering, parking arrangements, and anticipated duration. 5 days passed without acknowledgement. I sent a polite follow-up email. 3 more days of silence prompted a phone call to the HOA office, where the administrative assistant assured me that Marlene would respond when appropriate procedures had been followed. "I have followed all procedures," I explained. "This is a time-sensitive matter involving city officials. Mrs. Hodgkins will determine if procedures have been properly followed," came the unhelpful reply. Finally, 12 days before the scheduled meeting, I received an email requesting additional clarification regarding the nature of the proposed assembly. I provided expanded details about the watershed initiative, the officials' titles, and the environmental concerns to be discussed. I also noted that the gathering fell well within guidelines for permissible community activities as described in Section 12(4)(1) of the bylaws. The response arrived 4 days later. My gathering was provisionally approved, with conditions: no vehicles could park on the street, noise levels must remain appropriate for residential settings, and any materials displayed on my property, such as maps or presentation boards, must be removed immediately following the meeting. A final compliance inspection would occur the day before the event. While navigating this bureaucratic obstacle course, I continued preparations for the gathering itself. My neighbors proved unexpectedly supportive once they understood the purpose of the meeting. The Johnsons offered additional parking in their driveway. Mr. Bradley, a retired geologist, contributed historical survey maps showing how water patterns had changed with development. Even the young family across the street volunteered to postpone their children's outdoor playtime to ensure a professional atmosphere during the official's visit. As the date approached, I received confirmation calls from the mayor's office and each council member. All expressed enthusiasm about addressing the watershed concerns. Councilwoman Chen, who chaired the Environmental Committee, mentioned bringing additional documentation about similar problems in neighboring counties. The mayor herself called to confirm the meeting's agenda and to ask if I had capacity for 2 more attendees, representatives from the State Environmental Protection Agency who had expressed interest. My cabin was becoming the unlikely venue for a gathering that could reshape environmental policy for our entire region. Everything was falling into place. The presentation was prepared. The neighbors were supportive. The officials were engaged. I had even completed every procedural requirement imposed by the HOA. Still, a sense of unease lingered. Marlene's reluctant approval had come with an undertone of displeasure. Her final email had concluded with an ominous reminder. The Pinecrest HOA retains the right to revoke activity approvals should any violations of community standards be discovered prior to or during said activity. I dismissed my concerns as paranoia. What could possibly go wrong now? Friday afternoon arrived with perfect mountain weather, clear skies, and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine through open windows as I arranged chairs on my deck. I had transformed my living room into a presentation space with a projector borrowed from Mrs. Johnson, who taught at the local community college. Maps and environmental reports were organized on my dining table. Everything was ready. The doorbell rang at precisely 4:30 p.m. Marlene Hodgkin stood on my porch, clipboard held against her chest like armor, 2 HOA board members flanking her like deputies. I recognized them as Gerald Whitmore, a retired bank manager, and Patricia Sullivan, who had once cited the Bradleys for having wind chimes that were 2 inches above regulation diameter. Pre-event inspection, Marlene announced without greeting, as specified in your conditional approval. I stepped aside to let them enter, maintaining a polite smile despite the intrusion. Marlene moved through my home with practiced efficiency, making notes on her clipboard without explanation. She paused at the dining table, examining the watershed maps with narrowed eyes. "These materials are displayed prior to your approved gathering time," she said, pen scratching against paper. "They are inside my home, not displayed publicly," I replied. "I am setting up for tomorrow." Section 823 does not distinguish between public visibility and presence on community property. Patricia photographed my living room arrangement while Gerald counted the chairs on my deck. I followed them, increasingly bewildered by their focus on trivial details rather than substantive concerns. "You have 14 seats arranged outside," Gerald stated. "Your application specified 11 attendees, including yourself." "I wanted to ensure sufficient seating," I explained. "Some neighbors may join briefly." "That would exceed your approved guest count," Marlene interjected. "Additionally, these 2 vehicles in your driveway are mine and my partner's," I finished. "Guest parking will be managed according to the approved plan." The inspection continued for 45 minutes. They measured the distance between chairs, noted the types of refreshments I had prepared, and questioned my choice to use disposable cups instead of glassware. Finally, Marlene delivered her assessment. "We have identified several areas of potential noncompliance," she said, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. excessive seating arrangements, pre-deployment of presentation materials, questionable refreshment provisions that could encourage extended gathering duration beyond approved hours. Those are not violations of any bylaw, I countered, patience waning. This is a legitimate meeting with city officials about community environmental concerns. The board will evaluate these observations and determine appropriate actions, she replied, turning toward the door. You will be notified of any determinations. After they left, I called Mr. Bradley to relate what had happened. His response was immediate and alarming. They are looking for any excuse to shut you down, he said, voice grave. Marlene has opposed every environmental restriction ever proposed in Pinecrest. Her husband's construction company developed the Eastern Ridge properties, the very ones causing watershed problems. This connection had never occurred to me. The realization made Marlene's obstructionism suddenly make sense. She had personal financial interests at stake if stricter environmental regulations were implemented. That evening, I received confirmation calls from Mayor Sanderson and Councilwoman Chen. Both expressed enthusiasm about the next day's meeting. The mayor mentioned bringing aerial survey photographs showing erosion patterns. I did not share my concerns about HOA interference, not wanting to introduce political complications before the substantive environmental discussions could occur. Before bed, I double-checked everything. Presentation files were backed up on 2 devices. Printed materials were organized. Seating was arranged for optimal viewing of maps and diagrams. I even verified the HOA regulations once more, confirming that I had complied with every reasonable requirement. As I turned out the lights, a final call came from the mayor's chief of staff, confirming their arrival time of 10:00 a.m. I fell asleep confident that whatever Marlene's personal objections might be, the meeting would proceed as planned. Important people were committed to attending. The HOA could not possibly interfere with official city business. I had no idea how wrong I was. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. I woke at 6, giving myself ample time for final preparations. I brewed coffee, arranged refreshments, and reviewed my presentation notes one last time. Everything was proceeding perfectly until 8:17 a.m. when I pressed the power button on my coffee maker for a second cup, and nothing happened. At first, I assumed the machine had malfunctioned. Then I noticed the refrigerator had stopped humming. The digital clock on my microwave was dark. I flipped a light switch, nothing. A power outage. But outside, I could see neighbors' porch lights still illuminated in the morning shadow. The Johnson sprinkler system was running on its automatic timer. Only my cabin was dark. I hurried to my electrical panel, checking breakers that all appeared to be in the proper position. Resetting the main breaker produced no results. With growing concern, I called the utility company, navigating through automated menus until reaching a customer service representative. "Yes, I see your account," the representative said after I explained the situation. "It appears your service was suspended as of 7:30 this morning." "There must be a mistake," I insisted. "My account is current. I have automatic payments." "This was not a payment issue," she explained. "The disconnection was requested by the Pinecrest Homeowners Association under Municipal Code Provision 47.3, which allows property management entities to request temporary service suspension for unauthorized activities." Unauthorized activities? That is absurd. What unauthorized activities? "Let me check the notes." I heard keyboard clicking. The request cites unauthorized wild party with excessive attendees and potential community disruption. It was submitted yesterday at 7 p.m. and approved for temporary disconnection. My stomach dropped. 20 minutes after Marlene's inspection yesterday, she had moved to sabotage my meeting by having my power cut, and she had lied about the nature of the gathering to do so. "This is a scheduled meeting with the mayor and city council members," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not a party. I have HOA approval documentation. This is deliberate interference with municipal government functions." "I understand your frustration, but I cannot override an approved disconnection without proper authorization," the representative replied. "You would need to resolve this with your HOA or provide municipal documentation countermanding the request. The mayor will be here in less than 2 hours. How quickly can service be restored once I have that documentation?" "Typically, reconnection requires 24 to 48 business hours after." "Business hours? Today is Saturday." "Correct. Monday would be the earliest standard reconnection time." I ended the call and immediately contacted Mayor Sanderson's office, reaching her chief of staff's voicemail. Next, I called Councilwoman Chen directly, briefly explaining the situation. She expressed disbelief but promised to alert the mayor. Meanwhile, neighbors had noticed my distress. Mr. Bradley appeared at my door, followed shortly by Mrs. Johnson. When I explained what had happened, their reactions shifted from shock to outrage. "Marlene has gone too far this time," Mrs. Johnson declared. She disappeared, returning minutes later dragging a heavy-duty extension cord. "My house has power. We will run this from my garage to your refrigerator at least." Mr. Bradley made a similar offer, and soon bright orange extension cords snaked across my lawn from 3 different neighboring homes. We managed to power essential appliances, refrigerator, a few lamps, and my laptop, but the projector would draw too much current. The carefully prepared presentation would need to be shown on my small screen, huddled around by officials who expected a professional briefing. At 9:15 a.m. my phone rang, the mayor herself. "I understand there has been some interference with our meeting preparations," she said, her tone measured but clearly displeased. I explained the situation fully, including Marlene's inspection yesterday and the false claim of an unauthorized party. "Do you have documentation of your HOA approval for our meeting?" she asked. "Yes, complete with all correspondence." "And you believe this power disconnection is directly related to our watershed discussion?" "I have learned that the HOA president's husband owns the construction company responsible for the Eastern Ridge development, the same properties causing watershed damage." A moment of silence followed. "I see," the mayor finally said. "Please proceed with meeting preparations as best you can. We will arrive as scheduled." As I continued improvising solutions, a white SUV pulled into my driveway. Marlene Hodgkin stepped out, her face a mask of concern clearly meant for any observing neighbors. She approached my door with measured steps, clipboard in hand. I met her on the porch before she could ring the bell. "I have been informed of a power outage at your residence," she began, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Unfortunately, this means your gathering cannot proceed as planned, since residential events must maintain proper climate control and safety standards per Section 1427. I came personally to suggest rescheduling." "How thoughtful," I replied, making no effort to hide my sarcasm. "Especially considering the power outage was specifically requested by you under false pretenses." Her expression flickered briefly before resetting. "I am not sure what you mean. The HOA received reports of planned excessive noise and occupancy violations. We acted preventatively to maintain community standards." By lying to the utility company about an unauthorized wild party, when you knew perfectly well this is an official meeting with city leadership. Terminology may have been miscommunicated by clerical staff, she said stiffly. Nevertheless, without proper power service, your gathering cannot. She stopped mid-sentence, attention caught by something behind me. I turned to see a black town car with municipal plates turning onto my street, followed by two more official vehicles. The mayor had arrived, and Marlene's carefully constructed sabotage was about to collapse around her. Mayor Alina Sanderson did not look like a woman who tolerated nonsense. At 63, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had navigated decades of political minefields. Her silver hair was cut in a practical bob, and she wore hiking boots beneath her otherwise formal attire, sensible footwear for the mountain terrain she would be inspecting. She emerged from her vehicle and surveyed the scene before her. My darkened cabin, extension cords running from neighboring homes like orange lifelines, and Marlene Hodgkins standing frozen on my porch. Behind the mayor came Councilwoman Chen, Environmental Committee Chair, followed by Councilman Rodriguez and Councilwoman Williams. The municipal water director exited another vehicle, along with two individuals I recognized from the State Environmental Protection Agency. The chief of staff emerged last, already on his phone, speaking in clipped tones. I stepped forward to greet them, painfully aware of how unprofessional the situation appeared. Mayor Sanderson, thank you for coming. I apologize for the unusual circumstances. No apology necessary, the mayor replied, her eyes moving deliberately from the extension cords to Marlene and back to me. Perhaps you could introduce me to your visitor. Before I could speak, Marlene stepped forward with an extended hand and practiced smile. Marlene Hodgkins, Pinecrest HOA president. Such an honor to meet you, Mayor Sanderson. I was just expressing my concerns about the unfortunate power outage affecting this residence. The mayor did not take the offered hand. Interesting. My understanding is that this is not an outage but a deliberate service disconnection requested by your organization. Marlene's smile faltered. There appears to be some confusion. Our association has protocols for community safety that— Mrs. Hodgkins, interrupted Councilwoman Chen, consulting her phone. I have just received documentation from the utility company confirming that service disconnection was requested specifically by you at 5:47 p.m. yesterday, citing an unauthorized wild party at this address. Is that correct? Terminology may have been. A simple yes or no will suffice, the mayor interjected. Marlene's posture stiffened. Yes, I submitted the request, but within proper regulatory guidelines. This gathering exceeds approved community standards for— For what exactly? Councilman Rodriguez asked, stepping forward. A meeting with elected officials regarding public safety concerns. I was unaware that homeowners associations held authority over municipal government functions. Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside, I suggested, noticing neighbors emerging onto porches to witness the confrontation. The mayor nodded. Excellent idea. Mrs. Hodgkins, I believe your presence will be valuable for this conversation as well. We entered my darkened home, where battery-powered lanterns provided minimal lighting. The chief of staff remained on the porch, still engaged in an intense phone conversation. I offered what hospitality I could manage without functioning appliances, apologizing for the limitations. I have assembled the environmental data despite these challenges, I explained, opening my laptop. However, without power for the projector, we will need to view materials on this small screen. Mayor Sanderson turned to Marlene. Mrs. Hodgkins, am I correct in understanding that your husband's company, Hodgkins Development, was responsible for the Eastern Ridge construction project? The question hung in the air. Marlene's face drained of color. That is public record, yes, she finally answered, but entirely unrelated to today's situation. Is it? Councilwoman Williams spoke for the first time. Because interfering with a municipal investigation into environmental impacts that potentially implicate your family business seems remarkably relevant. This is not interference, Marlene insisted. It is enforcement of community standards that all residents agree to upon purchase. I retrieved my HOA documentation folder and extracted the approval form. I submitted proper notification 3 weeks ago and received conditional approval. There were no violations of any community standards. The mayor examined the documents carefully, then passed them to her colleagues. These appear to be in complete order. At that moment, the chief of staff entered. Mayor, I have the utility company's regional director on the line. They are prepared to restore service immediately pending your authorization. Excellent, the mayor replied. Please inform them that this is now a matter of municipal priority. You cannot simply override HOA protocols, Marlene protested, voice rising. There are procedures. Mrs. Hodgkins, Mayor Sanderson interrupted firmly. Are you suggesting that a homeowners association holds authority over elected government officials conducting official business? Because that would be a fascinating legal position to defend in court. Additionally, added Councilwoman Chen, deliberately interfering with a municipal environmental investigation through false statements to a utility provider potentially constitutes obstruction of governmental administration. Section 195.05 of the State Code, if I recall correctly. Marlene's face flushed. I did not. There was no intent to. This is simply a misunderstanding. The chief of staff returned. Service will be restored within 30 minutes. The utility company extends their deepest apologies for the inconvenience and has assured me that their approval protocols for HOA-requested disconnections will be thoroughly reviewed. Outside, neighbors had gathered on the street, watching the official vehicles and sensing the drama unfolding. Through my window, I could see Mr. Bradley explaining the situation to others. Community members who had suffered under Marlene's restrictive regime were witnessing her authority crumble in real time. Inside, the mayor addressed me directly. While we wait for power restoration, perhaps you could begin by walking us through the watershed concerns using your available materials. Mrs. Hodgkins will remain to provide any relevant HOA perspective on development impacts. Marlene sat rigidly in a corner chair, her clipboard clutched to her chest, as I opened my laptop and began the presentation that would change everything for our community. Precisely 26 minutes later, power returned to my cabin with a distinctive hum of resetting appliances. Lights flickered on, revealing faces gathered around my dining table, now illuminated by more than determination and battery-powered lanterns. The mayor nodded in satisfaction as my refrigerator resumed its steady drone. Now we can proceed properly, she said, glancing toward Marlene, who remained unnaturally still in her corner seat. With functioning electricity, I connected my laptop to the projector. Environmental data that I had painstakingly compiled over months now filled the wall in vivid detail. Topographical maps showing erosion patterns, water quality reports indicating concerning contamination levels, and side-by-side photographs documenting watershed degradation over the past 5 years. Councilwoman Chen leaned forward, examining a particularly troubling erosion model. The pattern follows exactly along the Eastern Ridge development, she observed, precisely where proper drainage infrastructure was supposed to be installed according to the approved permits. Drainage infrastructure was installed according to all approved specifications, Marlene interjected, finding her voice. Hodgkin's development maintains the highest standards of. That is demonstrably false, interrupted the municipal water director, pointing to a section of the map. These retention ponds were never completed, and the permeable surfaces required by Section 7.3 of the Environmental Impact Mitigation Plan were replaced with standard asphalt. We have satellite imagery confirming this. Marlene opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the doorbell. The chief of staff answered, returning with a utility company supervisor who apologized profusely for the disconnection. There appears to have been a serious procedural failure, he explained, handing me official documentation. HOA service suspension requests are supposed to require verifiable evidence of ordinance violations and a 72-hour notice period except in cases of imminent safety hazards. Neither requirement was met in this case. How interesting, said Mayor Sanderson, and yet service was disconnected anyway. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. The request came through our expedited channel reserved for municipal authorities and emergency services, which the Pinecrest HOA is neither, noted Councilman Rodriguez. As this exchange occurred, neighbors began arriving, not just the Johnsons and Bradleys who had provided emergency power, but others from throughout Pinecrest. Word had spread about the confrontation unfolding at my cabin. They gathered outside, visible through my windows, a growing audience to the power struggle happening within. The meeting proceeded despite Marlene's increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the environmental concerns. When the state environmental protection representatives presented correlation data between recent flooding and the Eastern Ridge development, she claimed insufficient scientific methodology. When the water director showed contamination patterns matching construction timelines, she questioned testing procedures. Her final defense crumbled when Mayor Sanderson produced a folder of her own. We have received 19 separate complaints from Pinecrest residents regarding HOA overreach in the past month alone, the mayor stated. Most notably, residents report selective enforcement of bylaws against those who raise environmental concerns while ignoring violations by board members and their associates. That is absolutely false, Marlene declared. Our enforcement is entirely uniform and... A knock at the door interrupted her. Mr. Bradley entered, followed by at least a dozen neighbors. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, addressing the mayor. "But when we learned city officials were here, we thought it important to provide relevant community information." What followed was an unprecedented community testimony. Residents described years of selective enforcement, retaliatory fines, and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Johnson, the community college professor, had compiled an actual statistical analysis of enforcement patterns, showing significantly higher citation rates for residents who had opposed board initiatives. Most damning was testimony from Patricia Sullivan, the same board member who had accompanied Marlene during yesterday's inspection. She had brought documentation showing that Marlene had dismissed multiple violation reports against properties developed by her husband's company, including serious drainage issues that contributed directly to the watershed damage. "I cannot be party to this any longer," Patricia stated, avoiding Marlene's glacial stare. "Not when it threatens our entire community's safety and well-being." Marlene's phone rang repeatedly throughout these revelations. The other board members, sensing disaster, were desperately trying to reach her. She ignored the calls, watching her carefully constructed authority disintegrate before her eyes. The mayor finally stood, addressing the now crowded room. I believe we have sufficient information to proceed with the following actions. First, an immediate engineering assessment of the Eastern Ridge development with mandatory remediation of all identified environmental impacts. Second, a formal investigation into the approval and inspection processes that allowed substandard construction to occur. Third, a complete review of the Pinecrest HOA's legal authority and enforcement practices. She turned directly to Marlene. Mrs. Hodgkins, I strongly suggest you consult with legal counsel regarding your position. Interfering with municipal investigations through false statements to utility providers represents a serious matter. What had begun as a simple community meeting had transformed into something much more significant. As residents nodded in agreement with the mayor's words, I realized that more than power had been restored to my cabin that day. The balance of power in our entire community had fundamentally shifted. The weeks following that Saturday morning unfolded with dizzying speed. Mayor Sanderson proved true to her word, initiating each promised action with remarkable efficiency. Engineers in yellow vests became common sights on the Eastern Ridge, conducting comprehensive assessments and marking areas requiring immediate remediation. Water quality testing stations appeared along the watershed, providing real-time monitoring accessible through a public website. Marlene Hodgkins submitted her resignation as HOA president 3 days after our meeting. The carefully worded statement cited personal reasons and family obligations, rather than acknowledging the true circumstances of her departure. The remaining board members followed within the week, creating a leadership vacuum that would prove transformative for our community. An emergency HOA meeting was called, held in the community center rather than the usual small office to accommodate unprecedented attendance. Nearly every household sent a representative, filling the room with neighbors who had previously avoided involvement in community governance. We need to completely restructure, argued Mrs. Johnson, who had emerged as a respected voice for reform. The current bylaws concentrate too much power in too few hands, with insufficient oversight and transparency. The proposal she presented, developed in collaboration with several neighbors including myself, outlined a new governance model for Pinecrest. It maintained necessary community standards while eliminating the arbitrary enforcement that had characterized Marlene's reign. Most significantly, it established an independent review process for all violation citations and a requirement that board members recuse themselves from decisions involving personal financial interests. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only 3 households opposed the changes, close associates of the former board who had benefited from selective enforcement. The new bylaws took effect immediately, with an interim leadership council elected to serve until formal elections could be held. Meanwhile, the municipal investigation into the Eastern Ridge development revealed systemic failures. Hodgkins' development had indeed cut corners on required environmental protections, replacing specified permeable surfaces with standard asphalt and never completing required drainage infrastructure. Perhaps more troubling, multiple inspection reports had been signed off despite obvious deficiencies. The relationship between the HOA leadership and the development company created a clear conflict of interest, concluded the official report. Regulatory oversight was compromised by personal financial entanglements. Remediation costs would be substantial. After initial resistance, Hodgkins' development agreed to fund the necessary corrections rather than face potential criminal charges for environmental violations. Construction crews returned to the eastern ridge, this time installing proper water management systems under the watchful eyes of both municipal inspectors and newly engaged community members. For my part, I found myself unexpectedly central to Pinecrest's transformation. The watershed initiative that had sparked the confrontation evolved into a comprehensive environmental stewardship program. Monthly meetings in my cabin, with fully functioning electricity, brought together residents, experts, and officials to monitor progress and discuss future sustainability efforts. "You have created something remarkable here," Mayor Sanderson told me during one such gathering. "Not just environmental protection, but genuine community engagement." The most visible symbol of change came 3 months after that fateful Saturday. The new community council approved my proposal for a neighborhood-wide native plant restoration project. On a sunny spring morning, residents gathered with shovels and wheelbarrows, replacing non-native ornamentals with indigenous species that would support local wildlife and reduce water consumption. Marlene Hodgkins drove past during the planting. She slowed briefly, observing neighbors working together in what would once have been multiple violations of her rigid regulations. Her expression remained unreadable behind sunglasses as she accelerated away. I have not seen her since. The final chapter of reconstruction occurred 6 months after power was restored to my cabin. The State Environmental Protection Agency released comprehensive new guidelines for mountain development, directly informed by the failures and subsequent corrections at our eastern ridge. Officials cited Pinecrest as a case study in both what to avoid and how communities could recover from environmental mismanagement. On the anniversary of that pivotal meeting, neighbors gathered on my deck, expanded now with proper permits and thoughtful design that enhanced rather than detracted from the natural setting. The mayor and council members returned, this time not to address a crisis but to celebrate progress. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across our community, I realized how profoundly things had changed. The power cut intended to silence a single homeowner had instead amplified an entire community's voice. The rigid control that had suffocated individual expression had given way to collaborative governance that preserved standards while respecting diversity. "It is remarkable what can happen," observed Mr. Bradley, raising his glass in a toast, "when someone stands up to a bully who has been left unchecked for too long." "Not just standing up," added Mrs. Johnson, "but standing up with purpose and principle. You never made it personal against Marlene. You fought for something bigger, our community and environment." The mayor joined our conversation. "Sometimes the most important changes begin with a single person refusing to be silenced," she said, "even when that silencing comes in the form of a power cut." I looked across my deck at the gathered neighbors, people who had once lived in isolation under the shadow of punitive rules, but now worked together to build something better. The extension cords that had once snaked across my lawn as emergency lifelines had been replaced by genuine connections between households. The clipboards and citation forms that had terrorized residents were replaced by collaborative planning documents and shared vision statements. That evening, as neighbors departed and stars emerged above the mountain ridge, I stood alone on my deck. The lights of homes throughout Pinecrest glowed warmly in the darkness, no longer under threat of arbitrary disconnection. The watershed below reflected moonlight, protected now by proper environmental safeguards and a vigilant community. In the distance, the eastern ridge showed signs of healing as native vegetation reclaimed properly prepared slopes. Marlene Hodgkins had intended to cut my power to protect her husband's financial interests and maintain her control over our community. She had not realized that true power never resided in her clipboard or her ability to turn off electricity. Real power, I had learned, exists in community connections, in principled stands against injustice, and in the unwavering belief that people working together can create something better than fear and control ever could. Sometimes losing power is exactly what you need to discover how powerful you truly are.